In the previous lectures, we already went ahead and created a custom progress bar renderer for both Android and iOS. This has allowed us to understand how is it that we can easily grab any kind of control really that we want to customize from some code-specific functionality. So for example, we have access to everything that those custom platforms provide without doing much further thing than adding just custom things in here and then exporting that so that Xamarin Forms is going to use that. Now we have had two scenarios in here. One in which we are just setting a value that we are just establishing directly from the code in here. In this case, when we scaled the progress bars. Now we saw that in Android it's a bit easier, but this is still a value that we're setting directly from this platform-specific code. The second scenario is a bit more dynamic. We are grabbing a value that is coming directly from the control, which is the progress, and that we are setting ourselves, but it is actually coming from a binding. So it's not something with which we have a ton of control. Of course, this is exactly what we want. We don't want a specific value. We want this to be dependent on that progress that changes whenever the user interacts with the application. But what I want to touch upon in this lecture and in the next one with Android is how can we actually set ourselves a value from XAML that will be used in a custom renderer for the custom renderer to do different things depending on that value. So if you're familiar, let me focus on iOS for a second in this lecture. And by the way, notice that I now have a few extra simulators because I updated to the latest version of Xcode, which already has the iPhone XR, XS, and XS Max simulators. Nice. And let me just focus again on iOS for a second. If you're familiar with iOS, you know that there are many different kinds of cells that can be listed inside of in the case of iOS, a table view, but let's just call it a list view because we may confuse a table view on iOS and a table view on Xamarin. They are not the same thing. However, currently we are not really modifying how our cells look. If we go ahead and search for expenses, by the way, because this is a different simulator, I have no expenses. Let me go ahead and quickly add a new one. We just see the regular cells. But if you have ever developed for iOS natively from Xcode, you know that cells can actually have what is called an accessory here to the right. An accessory that can be an arrow, can be like a check mark, can be maybe a disclosure indicator, but there are different things that we can do in here. And from XAML, we don't really have access to that. Let me go ahead and navigate over to my view, which in this case I was in the expenses page. We have this text cell, and if we search for something like the accessory, there really is no property here that we can set. But of course, because this is Xamarin, we have access to entirely native functionality, so we can create our own custom renderer. So let me go ahead and create a brand new custom renderer for the table view cells, or what in Xamarin are just cells. So just let me go ahead and create a new entity class that is going to be the custom text cell renderer. Now, as you already know, on Xamarin, when we create a cell, we want to establish what type of cell this is going to be. Is this going to be a text cell? Is this going to be a switch cell? Is this going to be an image cell? Is this going to be a view cell? So what we can do is actually establish to what kind of cell this custom renderer is going to be established. In my case, precisely, I am going to be establishing it to text cells, which means that these will only apply to my expenses page because my categories page is using view cells. So this will not apply to my categories page, which is, by the way, exactly what I'm looking for, because in here I don't want any accessories. So let's just go ahead and implement this. So because this is going to be for text cell, we have to inherit from the text cell renderer. Of course, we will need a using directive, and we will need to export this as something that Xamarin will use to replace the normal boring renderer for this awesome new custom text cell renderer. So I will just set the export like this, of course for text cells now with custom text cell renderers. So what we're going to be needing again in here is to override some methods. Now again, if you are familiar with iOS development, this is going to be way easier to understand. But in here we actually have the ability to override the getCell method. On iOS native development, this is the method that is executed every single time a new cell has to be displayed. Of course, because we are on the iOS project, this is exactly what is going to happen here on our Xamarin project. And what we have access to is the normal cell. Now here, that cell is immediately being returned. I don't want to return the cell immediately. So first I will get the cell as a variable, and eventually, yes, I am going to be returning it. But here in the middle is where I want to customize this cell depending on some value. So the item is actually going to, and you could use other properties in here, but it's going to contain the style ID, which is really just a string. Which means, and notice, let me go ahead and navigate over to my expenses page. In the text cell, we have access to the style ID. See where I'm heading now? We are going to be able to come here to our text cell, set a string in here, and use that string from the cell renderer to be able to modify our cell. So let's go ahead and do that. I am going to be switching the value in this item.styleID. And what I'm going to be evaluating are a few values in here, one for each of the accessories that can be assigned to a cell. So the first one is going to be the none case. We're also going to have a check mark, detail button, detail disclosure button, and disclosure. And here what I'm doing is simply that if the text is disclosure or in any other case, we're just going to do the same thing. Now, the things that we're going to be doing are changing the accessories. So notice that the cell is going to have an accessory property. And we can just set it to a UI table view cell accessory, which is an enum, an enumerable, with 5 options. And notice that we precisely listed 5 options, 5 cases when switching this. And all we have to do now is, of course, when the case of the style ID is none, we're going to set none as the accessory. When it is checkmark, we of course are going to set this to checkmark. And so on. And of course, eventually this cell is going to be returned. So let's go ahead and test this out right away. You remember how it looked before we did this. I'm not yet setting the style ID from SAML. Bear with me here for a second. I'm going to run this on the simulator. We're going to navigate over to the expenses and notice that there is now this arrow. Now this arrow, because we are not setting anything in here, the style ID is going to be quite empty, so it is the disclosure indicator, the one that is going to be used. But if we go ahead and change this to any of the other values, we're going to see something different. So let's go ahead and, for example, take a look at the detail disclosure button. What I will do then is over here on SAML, set the style ID to that string. And I will just run this. And this time in the list view, we see something entirely different. By the way, this is what I was referring to. That has both a disclosure indicator and a detail indicator. If we were, for example, to just leave detail button, we would only see that detail icon. So you can see how now by setting something from SAML, we can actually change how the item is going to look thanks to a text cell renderer. So it's going to be very similar to any other property that we set, except now the changes are applied to something that we customized ourselves. So it is something that we have entire control over. Now I'm going to finally show you the other item that we can set in here, which is going to be checkmark. Of course, if we set this to none, it's simply not going to display any accessory. Let's just take a look at that checkmark. You can see how it's just precisely a checkmark. So there you have it. This is how you can implement a custom render that is going to grab whatever you set in a specific property here on SAML to change the way the item looks. Of course, you could be using many other different properties that come directly from the item, or in any other custom renderer from whatever thing the renderer is going to receive. This is just a quick example, but of course, this is limitless. If you find any other element that you can set some value to it, as a string, as an integer, you will be able to, from custom renderer, evaluate what you're passing from SAML to change how it looks. So, in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at another example, in this case on Android.